For 3 months, I've been buried in maps that don't make the news, drought overlays, groundwater well logs, municipal water budgets, even insurance filings. Every data point led to the same chilling conclusion. The next housing crash won't start with interest rates or unemployment. It'll start when the faucets run dry. While most people are watching the Fed, I'm watching aquifers. The numbers tell a story no one wants to believe. Beneath our neighborhoods, the very foundations of American growth are quietly hollowing out. Cities still rising in price are, in reality, burning through their last reserves of water. And what happens to a mortgage when a city loses the one resource it can't print, borrow, or bail out? This isn't a doomsday fantasy. I've traced data from federal agencies like the U.S. Geological Survey, the Bureau of Reclamation, and dozens of state water districts, all warning in bureaucratic language that we're outspending nature's credit. What makes this terrifying is the denial. Developers are still pouring concrete, investors are still flipping homes, and policymakers are still pretending rainfall will fix the math. But it won't. There's a hidden clock ticking under every booming suburb, and when it hits zero, the collapse will look less like 2008 and more like a slow suffocation. Dry wells, soaring utility bills, halted construction, and plummeting demand. I'm going to walk you through the data city by city, where the limits have already been breached, where regulators are quietly freezing new permits, and where millions of families are unknowingly buying into a desert disguised as a dream. Stay with me until the #1 city, because it's still being aggressively marketed as future-proof, even as its water board quietly waves the red flag. Subscribe and hit the bell. I track risk signals before headlines do. Most people imagine a housing collapse as something loud and sudden, triggered by headlines and panic. But water-driven collapses are quieter, and that's what makes them dangerous. They unfold through a chain reaction that looks boring at first, almost administrative, until it's irreversible. It starts with water stress. That simply means demand begins to exceed what nature can reliably provide. Rivers shrink, snowpack fades, aquifers don't fully recharge. On paper, everything still works. In real life, the margin of error disappears. The next step is restriction. Cities impose watering limits, seasonal bans, or tiered pricing. This is where the first financial pressure appears. Utility bills rise not because of greed, but because infrastructure has to work harder to deliver less water. New pipelines, desalination plants, deeper wells, longer pumping distances. These costs don't stay abstract. They move directly into monthly expenses, HOA fees, municipal taxes. Home ownership quietly becomes more expensive, even before prices move. Then comes the moment most buyers never see: development control. When water systems can no longer guarantee supply, cities pause or cap new construction. You'll hear terms like assured water supply, which simply means proving there's enough water for decades, not just today. When that assurance fails, permits slow or stop. Growth-dependent economies stall. Jobs tied to construction, services, and expansion begin to thin out. This is also where insurance companies start paying attention. Insurance is the invisible referee in housing markets. It reacts faster than public opinion and with less emotion. As water scarcity worsens, insurers reassess exposure, reprice risk, or withdraw coverage entirely. That decision ripples outward. Lenders tighten requirements, investors quietly exit, developers shelve projects. None of this makes headlines, but it drains liquidity from the market one decision at a time, long before homeowners sense danger. There's a psychological lag here that traps people. We're conditioned to believe prices fall first and reasons come later. Water flips that sequence. The reason arrives silently, embedded in policy memos and engineering reports, while prices stay high just long enough to lure late buyers in. By the time the market realizes, the smartest money has already left, and only the most exposed remain. Meanwhile, geological consequences compound the problem. Aquifer drawdown means groundwater levels fall faster than they can recover. Subsidence occurs when land physically sinks, cracking roads and foundations. Salinity intrusion happens when overpumping allows saltwater to contaminate freshwater sources, rendering them unusable. These aren't temporary inconveniences. They permanently reduce a region's capacity to support life and value. Understanding this mechanism now doesn't make you fearful. It makes you prepared, informed, and capable of choosing stability over denial in uncertain markets ahead. By the time prices react, the decision has already been made upstream. Buyers vanish quietly, listings sit longer, sellers cut, then cut again. Pockets of collapse form while headlines still talk about strong markets. That's why this list matters. Every city I'm about to show you sits at the intersection of water stress and economic dependence. Growth met geology, and geology is winning. If you're buying or investing, subscribe and hit the bell. This is the stuff listings don't tell you. Number 10 is Orlando, Florida, and it feels almost unfair to put it on this list. When people think of Orlando, they picture rain, humidity, lakes, and endless green. Water scarcity doesn't even register as a possibility, but that confidence is exactly where the risk hides. Orlando depends almost entirely on the Floridan aquifer, and the region is pumping water at a rate that is already pressing against what scientists define as sustainable. That's the belief reversal. You assume abundance, but the system is stretched thin. As pressure drops underground, salt water from the Atlantic begins to push inward. Once salt contaminates a freshwater aquifer, it's not a temporary inconvenience. It's a long-term loss. Add in rapid population growth, with thousands of new residents arriving regularly, and the collapse pathway becomes visible. First come rising treatment costs, then higher utility bills, then restrictions that quietly chip away at desirability. Ask yourself honestly, what happens to home values when even basic water quality becomes uncertain? Number 9 is Atlanta, Georgia, another city that feels naturally protected. Trees, rainstorms, and a long history of growth create a sense of security. But Atlanta's problem isn't drought alone, it's geography. The city sits on a ridgeline with no major aquifer beneath it. Nearly all of its water comes from surface sources like the Chattahoochee River and Lake Lanier. That dependence has already been tested. During the severe drought of 2007, Atlanta was less than 3 months away from running out of water entirely. That wasn't ancient history, it was a warning shot. Since then, the metro population has surged, while reservoir capacity has slowly degraded due to sediment and evaporation. The collapse pathway here centers on risk and legality. Georgia has been locked in water disputes with neighboring states for years, and one unfavorable ruling could sharply reduce supply. Combine legal uncertainty with climate volatility, and stability becomes fragile. If you live in this region, think about it. Have water restrictions started to feel normal, almost routine? Number 8 is San Antonio, Texas, a city that prides itself on resilience and tradition. At first glance, it seems well-managed, even proactive. But San Antonio relies overwhelmingly on a single source, the Edwards Aquifer. It's a powerful resource, yet extremely sensitive to rainfall. When rains are plentiful, levels rebound quickly. When they aren't, they fall just as fast. Water restrictions have become a near-permanent feature of life here, quietly accepted as the cost of growth. To compensate, the city invested billions in pipelines pulling water from distant aquifers. These projects keep the system running, but they don't change the underlying math. More people are arriving, water is harder to secure, and the cost of keeping taps flowing keeps rising. The collapse pathway starts with affordability. Higher water rates push up monthly expenses, taxes rise to service infrastructure debt, and the low cost of living story begins to crack. Would you still see this market the same way if you knew its survival depended on emergency engineering? What connects number 10, number 9, and number 8 isn't drought panic or desert imagery, it's comfort. These cities feel livable, familiar, and safe. That sense of normalcy delays hard conversations. Buyers focus on what they can see: rain, greenery, functioning systems. The real constraints live underground, in courtrooms and inside planning documents few people read. Risk doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly. This is where perspective shifts. Preparation isn't pessimism, it's respect for reality. The early signals show up in utility bills, permit slowdowns, and policy changes that never make listings. Before we move on, consider your own city. Does it truly control its water future? or is it borrowing from tomorrow? Quick reminder, subscribe and hit the bell. The next cities are where things get ugly fast. Number 7 is Denver, Colorado, a city people move to chasing mountains, lifestyle, and the promise of balance. It feels clean, elevated, sustainable. But Denver's water reality is far less romantic. Roughly half of its supply is tied to the Colorado River Basin, a system already under historic strain. That means Denver doesn't just manage its own thirst, it shares scarcity with 7 states and tens of millions of people. As river flows decline, mandatory cuts are no longer theoretical. They're written into legal agreements. At the same time, Denver keeps growing outward, replacing grassland with pavement, creating heat islands that accelerate evaporation and demand. This is where growth collides with physics. For housing, the pressure shows up quietly. Utilities become more expensive. New developments face tougher approval. Insurance models start flagging long-term risk. Investors, who hate uncertainty more than bad news, begin to hesitate. The view stays beautiful, but the math underneath it doesn't. Ask yourself, how long does demand hold when a city's water future is negotiated in courtrooms instead of reservoirs? That hesitation doesn't crash markets overnight, but it thins them. Fewer buyers qualify, fewer builders commit, and lending quietly tightens. By the time water limits feel personal, price momentum has already shifted. That lag is where risk hides, invisible to headlines but brutal to late movers. And Denver sits squarely inside that dangerous gap today, especially for families stretching to buy. Right now, not later. Soon. Number 6 is Salt Lake City, Utah, where the conversation shifts from tight to toxic. The Great Salt Lake has shrunk dramatically, exposing miles of dry lake bed that were never meant to see daylight. Beneath that surface lies a mixture of arsenic, mercury, and heavy metals accumulated over centuries. When winds pick up, that sediment doesn't stay put. It becomes airborne dust, moving directly into neighborhoods, schools, and lungs. Scientists have warned that this isn't just an environmental issue, it's a public health threat. If the lake continues shrinking, the air itself becomes a liability. For housing, this changes everything. Insurance companies don't like chronic health risk. Lenders don't like locations that could become unlivable. Families don't stay where breathing feels unsafe. Migration doesn't wait for collapse, it anticipates it. As water diversion continues upstream and conservation fails to close the gap, Salt Lake faces a future where water scarcity isn't just about supply, but about survival. Who buys a home where the land beneath it is literally turning into poison? This isn't distant theory. Satellite imagery already shows the retreat accelerating year after year. Every exposed acre increases dust risk and decreases long-term confidence. Markets can ignore drought, but they can't ignore airborne liability. That's when values don't slide. They break unevenly and suddenly. Salt Lake is approaching that threshold faster than most people realize. And once crossed, there's no easy reversal. History shows that clearly, very clearly. Now, number 5 is Fresno, California, where the damage is happening underground and in plain sight at the same time. Fresno sits in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, but also one of the most overdrawn. As surface water from the Sierra Nevada becomes less reliable, farmers and cities turn aggressively to groundwater. The result is subsidence. Land sinks, roads warp, canals crack, wells tilt and fail. This isn't cosmetic damage. It permanently reduces the aquifer's ability to hold water, like crushing a sponge. State regulators have stepped in with pumping restrictions, forcing farms to scale back and reshaping the regional economy. For housing, the pathway is brutal. Agriculture supports jobs, migration, and demand. When water cuts production, employment shrinks. Infrastructure repairs raise taxes. Insurance flags ground instability. Lending tightens where foundations themselves are at risk. Fresno isn't collapsing all at once. It's being compressed. And compressed systems don't rebound easily. When the ground drops and the water disappears, so does confidence. Who invests long-term where the land itself is sinking? This is what slow-motion collapse looks like. Quiet, technical, and relentless. Buyers arrive chasing affordability, then discover the cost buried beneath it. Once belief breaks, markets reprice faster than narratives can adjust. That's the danger of ignoring geology in real estate decisions. Fresno is already paying that price. Others are watching carefully now and learning the hard way, unfortunately. Number 4 is Albuquerque, New Mexico, a city that once sold itself on the promise of endless groundwater. For decades, growth here was justified by an aquifer believed to be vast and resilient. Then the data corrected the story. Studies revealed the aquifer was smaller, slower to recharge, and more fragile than assumed. Conservation helped, but it didn't solve the core issue. Albuquerque now leans heavily on imported water from a river system already under stress. That means the city's future depends not just on its own discipline, but on upstream politics, climate volatility, and legal agreements it can't control. This is where water risk becomes policy risk. When allocations tighten, development slows, new builds face scrutiny, costs rise to secure supply. For housing, the impact shows up as stalled subdivisions, higher utility expenses, and a creeping sense of fragility that investors don't ignore. Demand doesn't vanish, but it hesitates. And hesitation is enough to change price trajectories in subtle, lasting ways. Number 3 is Los Angeles, California, a city built on imported water and confidence. Los Angeles doesn't survive on one source. It depends on several, and that diversification once felt like strength. Today, it looks like exposure. Northern water deliveries face environmental restrictions. The Owens Valley has been overdrawn for generations. The Colorado River, which props up much of Southern California, is in declared shortage. This is no longer a future concern, it's rationing reality. Outdoor watering limits, emergency declarations, and aggressive conservation mandates are already reshaping daily life. For housing, this translates into friction everywhere. New construction becomes harder to approve. Water costs rise as infrastructure strains. Renters feel pressure as supply tightens and costs shift downward. Homeowners feel it through fees, restrictions, and uncertainty. Los Angeles real estate has long been priced as untouchable, but even premium markets depend on basic utilities. When water access feels conditional, confidence erodes. Send this to anyone planning a move here, because the lifestyle calculus is changing faster than listings admit. Number 2 is Las Vegas, Nevada, where the tension between spectacle and survival is impossible to ignore. Las Vegas draws nearly all of its water from Lake Mead, the reservoir behind Hoover Dam. As lake levels fall, the language shifts from drought to thresholds. Terms like dead pool enter the conversation, describing a point where water can no longer flow through the dam. To avoid catastrophe, billions have been spent on emergency engineering, drilling deeper intake tunnels just to keep water moving. It's an engineering triumph, but also a warning. You don't spend that kind of money unless the risk is real. For housing, the consequences ripple outward. Water costs rise to fund these projects. Growth slows as regulators watch supply closely. Rentals tighten as population outpaces certainty. Investors who once loved the growth story now weigh concentration risk. One policy change, one deeper cut to river allocations, and the equation shifts overnight. That's what makes Las Vegas so fragile. It works until it doesn't, and markets hate binary outcomes. What connects Albuquerque, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas is that denial has ended. The risks are written into policy, budgets, and emergency plans. These cities aren't debating water scarcity, they're managing it in real time. Housing markets can survive fear, but they struggle with constraint. When regulators draw lines, when rationing becomes normal, and when billion-dollar fixes are required just to maintain status quo, the room for error disappears. Buyers feel it, lenders feel it, insurers feel it first, and once confidence cracks, demand shocks follow. We're approaching the top of the list, and this is where the disconnect between perception and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Number 1 is still booming, still expanding, still marketed as unstoppable. Yet regulators have already signaled the limit. Subscribe and hit the bell, because number 1 is the clearest smoking gun in America right now. Number 1 is Phoenix, Arizona, And this is where the investigation stops being a warning and becomes a verdict. Phoenix has been one of the fastest-growing housing markets in the country, selling sunshine, space, and opportunity to millions. But beneath that growth sits a brutal reality: extreme heat, relentless expansion, and groundwater math that no longer works. This isn't a future risk, it's already happening. The smoking gun came quietly, buried in state-level policy. Arizona regulators announced that groundwater supplies in parts of the Phoenix region are insufficient to support projected growth over the next 100 years. As a result, new subdivisions in outlying areas can no longer receive certificates of assured water supply. That phrase sounds technical, but its meaning is simple. Without proof of water, construction stops. Permits stall. Sprawl hits a wall. The engine that made Phoenix affordable begins to seize. Developers are scrambling. Some are hunting for loopholes. Others are trying to buy water rights, and a few are simply walking away. But geology doesn't negotiate. You can't zone more rain, and you can't refinance an aquifer. Phoenix already relies heavily on imported water from overstressed river systems, and groundwater was supposed to be the backup. Now the backup is failing too. When temperatures push past record highs year after year, demand explodes just as supply tightens. For housing, the consequences are immediate and structural. New supply slows while population pressure remains. Water costs rise as infrastructure strains to keep up. Insurance models reassess heat and scarcity risk. Lenders quietly adjust assumptions about long-term viability. This is how a boom city transitions into a constraint city. Prices don't crash overnight, but the foundation cracks. Buyers hesitate. Investors reassess. Migration patterns begin to shift. The emotional punch lands when you zoom out. A home is only worth what it can sustain. Square footage doesn't matter if utilities are rationed. Appreciation doesn't matter if growth is capped. Phoenix's story exposes a hard truth many markets are trying to avoid. Growth without water is not growth, it's delay. This is why Phoenix sits at number 1. Not because it's already empty, but because the denial is deepest here. The policies are in motion, the limits are set, the clock is running. If you're buying on the fringe, betting on endless expansion, you're betting against physics and policy at the same time. And those bets rarely pay. If you want updates as policies change and this story develops, subscribe and hit the bell. Because informed decisions today protect families, finances, and futures tomorrow, especially in places like this now. If you step back and look at all 10 cities together, a clear pattern emerges. It isn't politics, it isn't hype, and it isn't bad luck. It's water stress colliding with growth, legal limits, and rising infrastructure costs. When those 4 forces align, housing markets become fragile no matter how desirable they look on the surface. Prices can stay high for a while, but resilience quietly disappears underneath. What you've seen here isn't 10 separate stories. It's one story repeating in different places at different stages. The good news is this: you don't need to be a hydrologist or an insider to protect yourself. You just need to ask better questions than most buyers are asking. Wherever you're considering living or investing, start with the source. Where does the water actually come from? Is it local groundwater that recharges naturally, or imported water that depends on distant rivers and politics? Then look at growth controls. Are permits slowing, being capped, or quietly delayed? Those signals matter more than marketing. Next, watch costs instead of prices. Are water rates rising faster than inflation? Are cities proposing new fees, bonds, or taxes to pay for pipelines, treatment plants, or emergency projects? That money always comes from residents. Then examine the ground itself. Is there land subsidence from overpumping? Salinity creeping into freshwater supplies? Toxic dust risks from drying lakes? These are not abstract environmental issues. They directly affect insurance, lending, and livability. Finally, zoom out to the legal landscape. Are there interstate water disputes, court rulings, or federal allocation cuts looming? Markets hate uncertainty, and water law creates plenty of it. One ruling can change a city's trajectory overnight. When you put all of this together, you begin to see housing not as a gamble, but as a system that either supports itself or slowly breaks down. This checklist isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to shift your identity from reactive buyer to informed decision maker. The people who get hurt in housing downturns aren't the ones who ask hard questions early. They're the ones who assume tomorrow will look like yesterday. Knowledge doesn't eliminate risk, but it gives you options when others have none. Now I want to hear from you. Which city do you think cracks first and why? Drop it in the comments and debate it out. And if there's another city, state, or trend you want me to investigate next, tell me. I'll keep tracking the data and updating the maps as reality changes. Subscribe and hit the bell. I'll keep posting updated risk maps regularly updated.